More than ever before, women played key roles in World War II. Whether they were manning the home front, working in factories, or doing the actual fighting, there were strict rules to be followed if they wanted to make it out alive. While women participated in the Nazi project at every level, they had one ability that even the most rabid male Nazi lacked: the power to give birth to the next generation of Aryan children. Though, quote, racially pure men and women were both encouraged to reproduce, mothers were especially valued in Nazi thought and policy, as it was through them the master race would grow and become more powerful. And once they were born, women were tasked with indoctrinating their children with Nazi ideals from the cradle. In fact, the Third Reich took the job so seriously that they gave medals for producing baby Nazis. The Gold Mother's Cross rewarded women who had at least 4 children, with the highest grade going to those who produced 8 or more children for the Reich. All this assumed, of course, that both parents were racially and ideologically acceptable. By the time the last Mother's Cross was awarded in 1944, over 4.7 million of these medals had been awarded. Soldiers' morale was of the utmost importance. The United States established a system of entertainment to brighten troops' deployments, whether they were stationed at home or overseas. Big names sang, danced, told jokes, and brought much-needed levity and warmth through the famous USO shows. Among the most famous entertainers to make the tour was Marlene Dietrich. The elegant German actress and chanteuse had left Germany to pursue a career in Hollywood and refused to return home for the obvious reason.
Nazi agents asked Dietrich to come home to Germany to make propaganda films for the Third Reich. But she's a staunch opponent of the Nazis.
Dietrich performed hundreds of times for Allied troops, often appearing at bases close to the front. She also had a side hustle doing some spy work for the OSS. That's the precursor for the CIA. Fate rewarded Dietrich for her physical and moral courage when she had the joy of announcing the D-Day invasion to her audience during a performance in Italy. Espionage was a serious concern. You know how we just said that Marlene Dietrich did a little spy work? She was also investigated by the FBI to make sure she wasn't spying for the Germans. The idea is that anyone could be looking to get their hands on some intel. Domestic propaganda campaigns throughout the Allied countries emphasized the danger of discussing army movements, war work, or anything that could conceivably be of military use to Axis operatives. The popular slogan stateside was "Loose lips might sink ships," and in the UK the catchphrase was "Careless talk costs lives." While these campaigns weren't exclusively aimed at women, the outsized presence of women on the home front meant that they were the main recipients of the message. No matter who you were, the best thing to say about your war work was nothing at all. Rosie the Riveter became an American icon for good reason. With the enlistment of much of the male workforce, women were working outside the home in greater numbers than ever before. Factories producing materials, weapons, vehicles, and just about everything were increasingly staffed by women, as were farms growing the food needed to feed Americans both at home and fighting abroad. Women doing war work faced challenges, including sexism from the men who stayed behind. Still, the experiment of women's wider participation in the economy was a raging success. Not only did American industrial production help bury the Axis powers under a level of materials and munitions the enemy simply couldn't match, but the money women made, and often saved, during the war helped boost post-war prosperity. A massive cultural shift had begun, and more women would work outside their homes in future generations.
For the first time in American history, all 4 branches of the military create special units for women.
Over 640,000 British and 350,000 American women served in uniform. The vast majority of women served in support roles. However, the Soviet Union went one step further. Given both the desperation of its fight against the Nazi invasion and the socialist ideal of gender equality, Soviet armed forces became the first to enlist women as fighters. Soviet women flew combat missions, crewed tanks, and served with particular effectiveness and distinction as snipers. One Soviet sniper, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, notched 309 confirmed kills before injury forced her to retire from the front. We covered her in depth in another video. We're going to link it up there so you can check it out. But anyway, one of the things she did was do a goodwill tour of sorts in the US. And by goodwill, we mean trying to shame the Americans into joining the European theater. In Chicago, she addressed a rapt crowd saying, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupiers by now. Do you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Wartime meant shortages and rationing, including fabrics, which were needed by the armed forces for uniforms and supplies like parachutes. The British utility dress available with ration coupons was so flatteringly simple that even non-rationed clothing began to imitate its style and silhouette. Sequins weren't on the ration list, so a little creativity with a needle could add sparkle to an otherwise drab outfit. And then there were nylons. Until shortly before World War II, women's stockings were usually made of silk. More affordable nylon options came onto the American market in 1939 and were an instant hit, just in time for the war to eat up the fabric supply.
Agnes, look, on that dang nylon.
To replicate the look of nylon stockings, women painted their legs, often with gravy browning, sometimes including a dark pencil seam down the back of the leg to complete the illusion. One place you probably never expected to find women working was a Nazi death camp, but shockingly they did, and sadly they were just as brutal as the men. Among the most notorious of Hitler's female concentration camp officers was Irma Grese, whose youth and physical attractiveness made the allegations against her more shocking. A shy farm girl, Grese became a committed Nazi believer as a teenager, and in 1942, at the age of 18, she became a prison guard at Auschwitz. In addition to the psychological torture she inflicted, she personally beat, whipped, and set dogs upon prisoners under her control. Grese was also responsible for selecting people to be sent to their deaths in the gas chambers. Captured in the spring of 1945, Grese was convicted by a British tribunal and executed by hanging at the age of 23. The royal families of countries in Hitler's way had two choices: stay and risk death, or flee, but fleeing meant remaining active in the fight. When Hitler invaded neutral Luxembourg, Grand Duchess Charlotte and her family fled. She spent the war primarily in Canada and the United Kingdom, meeting U.S. President Roosevelt several times and broadcasting messages to her people in occupied Luxembourg. Both her husband and son fought under the British flag, and in 1945, Charlotte returned to Luxembourg to reign for another 19 years. Queen Wilhelmina had ruled the Netherlands since 1890. She managed to steer the Netherlands' neutral course through World War I, but was unable to keep the Nazis from overrunning her country in 1940. From England, Wilhelmina broadcast regularly to her people to keep their spirits up and was enthusiastically welcomed home upon the country's liberation. Citizens of occupied countries could and did sabotage, undermine, and frustrate the activities of their enemies. Resistance forces sprang up throughout occupied Europe, but were especially strong in France and Yugoslavia, and included many women. French women smuggled weapons, sabotaged German communications, and helped those in danger escape the country. Allied airmen shot down over France were sometimes rescued and hidden by local women, many of whom remain anonymous to this day, because it was safer to use false names. Yugoslavian women were, if anything, even more ferociously opposed to German occupation, and some of them participated in active combat with local partisans. They also organized ways to keep local populations fed during the war, forming units to do farm work and prevent enemies from stealing the crops to feed their troops. Yugoslav women were both rewarded and punished for their resistance. Over 100,000 received decorations of merit for their actions, but over 600,000 were killed, representing over a third of Yugoslav deaths during the war. British food rationing began in January 1940. The first commodities to be rationed were butter, sugar, bacon, and ham. But by 1942, nearly everything was on the list, except for fresh vegetables, fruit, and fish. Homemakers had to think creatively and practice smart home economics to keep their families fed during the conflict. Each person had an allotment of ration points, which varied according to individual circumstance. For example, expectant or nursing mothers or those with physically demanding jobs got more. Gardening, at home or on shared public land, could supplement a family's food stores, as could purchases on the black market. Of course, you needed the right connections and the cash to pay the inflated prices these off-the-record goods could command. When the war ended, women across the globe found themselves living in a world that was forever changed. While women everywhere faced cultural changes, perhaps the biggest adaptations were required of Japanese women. The conservative Japanese society that brought the empire into World War II had lagged behind other countries in terms of enlisting women for war work, but by the war's end, over 4 million Japanese women were employed in key industries. Surrender left Japan badly damaged from bombing, chronically short food, and occupied by the United States, whose way of life could not have been more different. On paper, this led to Japanese women gaining rights.
Enfranchising Japanese women was a simple yet important way to democratize.
Some Japanese women became involved with men in the occupying forces and married them, becoming war brides and returning with their husbands to the United States. Though these women initially faced racialized barriers to immigration, by 1959, Japanese wives of American servicemen had increased the Asian-descended population of the United States by 12%.